Afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting in just a minute, letting the rest of the crowd gather here, but we really appreciate your attendance today at our webinar on building effective small transit boards of directors. All right. Well, welcome, everyone. My name is Scott Bogren. I'm the executive director here at the Community Transportation Association of America, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to a first for our association, which is a two-day series of webinars and workshops for our members, board members. This is going to be I think a lot of really good content shared with you, and I'm going to go over some kind of ground rules, I guess we'll call them. This session is going to be in a webinar mode, so all participants will be muted. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat box, and I'll be monitoring those, and I have some of our very capable staff are also going to be monitoring those, and we'll be trying to answer those while the presenter's going. And then at the end of each of the sessions, I will have some discussions over some of the bigger themes that we saw during that part of the session, and we'll try to base that on the questions, but we will try to answer all of the questions. All of these today and tomorrow, all of this was being recorded and will be made available directly to our membership. We're going to post it online as well. Really, as we are making our first foray into providing this training, what we want to have is keep this readily available so that for each of you and for all of our members, as they orient and welcome new board members, that they can use these videos and the documents that are attached to these videos as materials to hopefully bring new board members up to speed. Give you some insights on why we're hosting these sessions, and it's increasingly clear to us that it's critical to have effective boards of directors at our members. And we had often said that in meetings and sessions, but had never done anything to kind of provide the baseline and some of the educational pieces that create that good synergy between a transit system of whatever type it might be and the boards. And really, over the last year and a half, we've had several members where the board, at a board meeting, the board has been presented with a surprise. And the older we all get, surprises are almost always bad. And these were bad surprises where a general manager is sharing with the system, the board, hey, we can't make payroll next week. And when you start to work back, we want to provide the skills and the expertise for board members to be able to get ahead of those issues, deal with them, and deal with them effectively. We recognize that we have a breadth of members in our organization, in our 1,200 plus members. We've got public agencies that have certain types of boards. We've got nonprofits that have different. We have private sector boards. I'm on a board where we are called trustees and not board directors. We recognize that all of you may have a little bit of uniqueness to what you're doing in your locality or some uniqueness, but trust me when I tell you that the sessions that we're providing here today are really designed to cover all those varieties. And as I mentioned in the chat box, you will definitely be able to ask questions. And I want to make sure that you get out of this time what you need. So ask those questions and make sure we can get you those answers. For some of you, you may not want to have that question publicly, but it's still a very important question to you. As I turn the control here over, I'll put my email address into that chat box and urge you, if you have any questions directly that you'd like dealt with more discreetly, to please send those our way, and I'll make sure we answer all of those questions. Before we get started, here's our schedule today. We are in the intro. Chris Zeilinger is up next. He's going to cover transit funding in the FTA. Bill McDonald will do transit board governance purposes and practices. We hope to end a little before 6. And then tomorrow, we will pick back up at 4 o'clock Eastern. Same link that you used to get in here will work. And we're going to be talking about improving board literacy. Kristen Joyner, the current president of the CTAA board and someone who does a lot of board training, will be leading that session. And then the second session tomorrow, CTAA's training and certification director Karen Souza will be covering succession planning, one of the kind of key actions that a board sometimes has to take. So with that, again, thanks for giving us some of your time and joining us today. And I will stop share and turn the control of this session over to Chris Zeilinger. And while he is loading up his presentation, I'll give an introduction to Chris. I have worked in an office in and around next to Chris for the better part of approaching 33 years. He started a month after me. So we are from the same general time period. Chris's expertise and what he brings to our association as an associate director is a passion for nuance and the details that are in all types of federal regs. Chris has worked in communities all around the country on all forms of public transit, starting systems, improving systems, helping systems. He's done all that and so much more. And I think for those of us on the CTAA staff, there are just certain questions we get that only Chris can give us an answer to, that we probably too much depend on him. So I'm pleased to turn the control of the session over to Chris and welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you, Scott. And it is a pleasure and a delight to be with everyone here today. Yeah, I just want to, let's see here. This is right. Want to put things in a little bit of context. I find even in the bits of time where I've served on boards or been close to boards, transportation or otherwise, there's a lot of alphabet soup that's out there and a lot of assumptions that are out there. And I know, as you had said, Scott, that the membership of CTAA's organization, we are a very diverse lot in terms of the kinds of organizations, the kinds of missions that agencies have, the funding streams and so forth. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about funding today, because one of those key areas that any transit agency has to work with is its funding. And the board members, however you all are structured, have a key role. Part of it is to understand where the funds come from, how they're used, without getting in the weeds. We assume, I'm going to talk a little bit about assumptions here. We assume you have some kind of executive person, a transit manager, a general manager, a director, an executive director, whatever he or she is called, some person, a professional whose job it is to make the transit system run, and you as board members are setting general policy rules, hiring that person, all these things that my colleagues will be talking about later today and then again tomorrow afternoon. We assume there is that kind of person, that you yourself as a board member don't have to handle all of the details of the day-to-day running of the organization. I'll go off script a little bit and just say, if you as a board member are having to do all of the day-to-day details of running your organization, that might be a little bit of a yellow or red flag caution issue, but I'll just park that out there to one side for you all to kind of wonder about. What I'm going to share with you for the next few minutes is talking a little bit about transit funding and the Federal Transit Administration. Almost, but I'll be honest, not all, but almost all of our members at CTAA receive some degree of funding from the Federal Transit Administration. There are some organizations that don't, but almost everyone does. Sometimes that comes to your agency directly, sometimes indirectly. The percentage of your agency's budget that come from FTA funds might be small, it might be very large, it might be huge, but it's there. So you will frequently, or you should frequently, be hearing from your transit manager the letters FTA a lot. So a couple of structural things. In rural areas and in some smaller urban areas, and for some smaller specialized organizations that are in major metro areas, your FTA funds probably go through the state or some other intermediary before they come to your organization. So to illustrate what I mean, if your organization is a provider of rural public transportation, yes, you get federal funds, but the federal transit funds come to your organization through your state Department of Transportation. There is no way that a rural transit provider can get their core formula funds directly from FTA. You might get other grants on the side, but your core funding comes through the state. So the state plays a very vital role. I'll be touching on that a few points as we keep moving forward. In larger urban areas, I didn't look to see who all signed up, so I'll just rattle off major metro areas like Des Moines or Shreveport. We have a board member from Shreveport, Louisiana, or places like that are like where our member organization is the primary urban transit provider in a major urban area. There's actually details about population there where the cutoff points are. They get their funds directly from the Federal Transit Administration. Conversely, if you happen to be a part of a tribal public transportation program housed within a tribal nation, you probably get your funds directly from FTA, the Federal Transit Administration. But so that's a bit of a split. And if you're a small organization that's in a large metro area, for instance, for a while, I served on the board of a nonprofit transit provider here in the DC area. They got their federal transit funds through the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, which is a planning body for the DC metro area. So they got their funds indirectly through that path. So there's some different ways that folks get funds. And yes, there's a lot of non-FTA funding that might flow from the federal government into your organization with its own funding streams. But we're going to talk today about FTA stuff. I'm going to focus my conversation and my remarks on some FTA funding, formula-based funding programs. I'll get into those in a second. But first, I want to mention something that I've heard an awful lot in various ways from a lot of, maybe some of you in the session today, but some of your counterparts at other transit systems boards of directors. If you collect passenger fares, and most public transit agencies collect some passenger fares, that fare box revenue is this tiny, tiny, tiny little sliver of receipts. It is not your core source of revenue. It may be significant. New York City Transit Authority gets about 40%, 40% of their bus expenses are covered through fare box collections. That's just 40%. And that's an outlier. Most smaller transit systems, fare box receipts cover anywhere from 2 to maybe 8 or 9 or sometimes 10% of your revenue, sometimes a little bit more, but it may be a noticeable sliver, but it's a sliver. The fare box receipts, the money that's collected in cash fares or their equivalents from your passengers, is not the driving force of your budget. It might be a leveraging thing in terms of being able to open up funding opportunities, but it's pretty small. And it's, You should expect it to be small. You should not be worried as a board member that your fare box collections are not huge or not making up a huge portion of your budget. I'll mention one aside. I've worked some transit systems where the cost to the agency of collecting and reconciling and depositing and managing those fare box collections was actually greater than the amount they collected at the fare box. To me, that's not a problem, other than maybe an argument for that system to go fare free to save itself some money. But let's talk about Federal Transit Administration funds. You'll often hear, whether it's from us at CTAA or folks from your transit agency or from your state, 53 this, 53 that, 53 whatever. I could probably spend an hour going into why it's called 5307 and so forth. I won't do that. But there are some core funding programs that support, one or more of which support almost every public transit agency here in the US. Just rattling off what you can see on your screen. 5307 are formula-based grants from the Federal Transit Administration for public transit in areas, census designated urban areas with populations above 50,000. Sometimes that for the smaller urban areas, that those funds may, or sometimes don't, pass through a state to get to the transit agency. In areas with populations over 200,000, those funds go directly to what's called a designated recipient in that urban area, which means that entity has a more direct relationship with FTA as opposed to working through the state. There's always exceptions in states like New York State or Florida. The state DOT is involved at every size of urban and rural public transit system, but some states really have different rules with their larger versus smaller entities. 5310 is a program, formula-based grants to states and urban areas for projects that serve the mobility needs of elders and people with disabilities. Sometimes that's fused with a public transit program. Sometimes those funds go over to primarily not-for-profit or other special service agencies that focus just on those populations. But in any case, it's federal transit funds, and that's important to recall that those are federal transit funds. 5311, formula-based grants from FTA to the states or DC, Puerto Rico, the other territories as state equivalents, but they go directly from this to the states, not to local recipients, to support public transit in rural areas. And then because almost everyone, I suspect, in today's session is providing some form of bus. I use the term bus fairly loosely, but we're talking rubber-tired vehicles that run on public roads. Everyone here is probably involved with bus-related transportation. 5339 is the major source of grants from FTA for buses and bus facility projects. And those sometimes go directly to a unit of local government, even in a rural area. Sometimes they go through a state, sometimes they go through to an urban public transit system. It's all over the board, but 5339 are for primarily the acquisition of buses and construction of bus facilities. There's a few things around the edges you can also do. But those are some key programs. There's others out there. There's funds that come from Federal Highway Administration through a program called CMAQ that sometimes supports some commuter and local transit operations in areas with air quality problems. There's other funds from Federal Highway Administration that often support transit. There's funds that some agencies get from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to support what we would think of as public transit. So these are not the exhaustive list of these and only these can support transit, but these are the most common funding streams that transit agencies like yours will receive either directly from FTA or through your state Department of Transportation. Now let's think about some of the mechanics of how that works. Again, you as board members, you probably do have to occasionally sign off on things. Every state, every agency is different in how this is done, but you're going to be involved at least at the launching, approving a grant or an agreement with a state, or signing an agreement with FTA if you're a direct recipient of FTA funds. So your board or your board chair will probably have some involvement here, but that most of the details will be handled by your transit manager. But let's think about a couple things. One, like so many public sector funding and even some private sector funding, FTA funds are handled typically handled on a reimbursement basis. That means that your transit agency fronts all of the costs. Then at the end of a billing period, your state will reimburse you with the FTA funds it receives, or if you're a direct recipient, FTA will reimburse you for the federal share of funds. But typically, your transit agency has to front the costs. As a board member, this is a good thing to know because it places a financial burden. You don't want to be stuck in a weird spot. I'll just say weird. If you don't have enough funds to cover costs that will eventually be recouped. FTA does not do advanced funding. FTA does not do lines of credit. FTA will reimburse its share of eligible costs after they have been incurred. So you've got a financial management responsibility that you as a board and your transit manager have to stay on top of. All right, now to get a little bit into transit weeds a bit, federal transit projects differentiate between operating costs. Those are, to me, this sounds obvious, but I've been talking about this stuff for decades. Operating costs include driver salaries and benefits, and basically the cost of having someone drive the bus, and things like fuel, oil, consumable things that make the bus wheels on the bus go round and round. Those are operating costs. Capital costs, the other major category of federal transit spending, are going to be for getting a new bus or major overhaul of an existing bus or getting a bus facility or major renovations to a facility, those types of things. I mentioned that delineation because typically your transit system will have to break out an operating budget and a capital budget because they're reimbursed at different federal rates. There's some areas that kind of are in a gray zone. There's a sliver of activity that some transit systems do that's called, quote, mobility management that can kind of go either way. So your transit manager might be leveraging a better match rate for your on your system's behalf to go one way versus the other. I'll use the phrase preventive maintenance. It's actually called associated capital maintenance in technical terms, but there's some maintenance related expenses that again can be categorized kind of either way. There's some other things that kind of are in that gray zone between operating and capital. You need to be sure if your transit manager is doing things that don't seem cut and dried, ask a lot of questions of your manager. Don't assume, he or she is trying to do something nefarious. Just ask questions. There's probably a good answer, but it's good to ask questions. Another key thing to think about, which ties into operating versus capital. In general, operating costs, the federal government will cover 50% of your net operating loss. It's a transit accounting term, but basically 50% of around 50% of your operating budget, the FTA funds will cover. 80% of your capital funds expenditures, the federal government will cover. Those match rates change sometimes in some states, so it's not always 50-50 or 80-20. But think of that, there's the big distinctions there. And so then the question is, where does that other 50% come from? Again, think about you as a transit aid, your system as a transit agency. It fronts all of the costs and then will eventually get reimbursed 50% of its operating expenses roughly and 80% of its capital expenses as a reimbursement. So where does that money come from? Because some of that's going to be used as the non-federal share, or what we will quickly call, quote, local share of your transit projects. Some of that will come from, in many cases, your state governments might have some state generated funds they use to help cover a portion of the matching funds. Not every state does that, or they'll have their own rules about what can or can't be covered. Many times local governments, cities, counties, what have you, will be providing a significant amount of the local share. Presumably, if your transit manager doesn't know where the local match is coming from, you're going to have a problem on your hands. So you've identified these sources. Another major area that is the treatment of which is unique to FTA programs is in many systems, especially those that are serving particular populations, seniors, people with disabilities, low-income populations, and in a lot of rural areas, there's a lot of your local match, quote, local match will come through contracts or other arrangements your transit agency has with entities that needs transportation service for their clientele, whether that's older adults that need transportation to get to and from senior centers or congregate meal sites, or by and large, the hugest, most common thing are individuals that are covered that are on Medicaid for one reason or another, and they're more or less routine, but medically necessary transportation will be covered by your state's Medicaid agency. And there will be others. We've seen transit agencies that have arrangements with private schools or public schools. I'll talk about a key concern there, but there's ways to do that. I've heard of arrangements with local hospitals. I've heard of arrangements with employers where major employers in an area will cover a portion of the cost for getting its employees from their homes to their place of work. So there's a lot of arrangements out there. The point is your transit system needs to have a stable base of those non-federal funds. Now, you heard me say Medicaid. You heard me talk about social senior services in some communities. There's a few others, some job training things. In FTA programs, those dollars through a service contract are eligible as the quote non-federal share of project cost. That is not double dipping. That is allowed under federal law. Your agency can do that. It is not going skating on thin ice as long as it's following your policies and procedures and your state transit administering agency from your state Department of Transportation and the partner agency, for instance, if it's Medicaid, your state Medicaid agency, whatever their rules are, senior services, your area agency on aging and state unit on aging, whatever their rules are. As long as the rules are being followed, FTA allows those dollars to be treated as if they were non-federal in nature. This is actually a good thing. This is where a lot of the sustainable financing of local transit programs comes from. So don't feel like your transit manager is trying to fleece you and the federal government by having a Medicaid arrangement. They're actually probably doing, and 99 times out of 100, doing the right thing for you, your transit system, and your community. So just wanted to kind of put that reminder, because I've encountered some boards that get really surprised by that. They're saying, how can this be allowed? It is allowable. Again, if it's as part of an arrangement with an FTA program. So, and if you ever have questions about that, talk to your transit manager first, see how they explain it. If you're concerned, talk to the agencies that fund your transit system, make sure they're okay. Or if you really think this is kind of weird or are having a hard time understanding what they're telling you, reach out to one of us here at CTAA and we'll explain. Or if we see a problem, we'll say, oh, that doesn't sound good. There are going to be rules. I have run into so many transit board members that are surprised by the regulatory stuff that falls on their transit system. They're thinking, where did all this stuff come from? I'll spare you the history. I won't go into the details of what these are or how to comply, but yes, there are a lot of rules. Some of them apply no matter what your transit agency is. For instance, no one is allowed to discriminate people on the basis of race or gender or ethnic origin or religion or things like that. So that civil rights stuff, that applies even if you don't take one dime of federal money. I'll chime in to say the Americans with Disabilities Act, the requirement that services be accessible to users with disabilities. That also applies even if you don't get one dime of federal money. That's just a basic civil rights requirement. There's some things that apply to transportation providers, regardless of where they get their money from. If you're driving vehicles over a certain size, the driver has to have a commercial driver's license that's issued by the state. If you're doing transportation of almost any kind, there's going to be federal workplace drug and alcohol testing rules. The details will vary, but there's going to be drug and alcohol testing. There's going to be other employment-related requirements. You can't employ people that don't have the legal right to work in the United States. So that applies, again, just as an employer. There's going to be some procurement laws. I have spent day-long classes teaching procurement stuff. I'm not doing that right now. There are going to be a lot of very persnickety procurement rules that sometimes your transit manager needs to stay on top of. Otherwise, he or she might be imperiling themselves, your transit agency, and you as a board. So make sure that you're following the right rules, because states do their own stuff. I was right before the pandemic doing some training in one state where the state had a lot of very state-specific rules that all the transit providers needed to follow. Didn't matter what the Fed said, the states had their own twist on stuff. So your manager needs to pay attention to these things. And then FTA has a whole litany of stuff that it layers into everything itself. National Transit Database reporting. Two things that I'll mention that are key are charter service. A lot of times a well-intentioned manager or a well-meaning board member says, oh, can't we use our buses to take people to the golf tournament that's in town, or to the county fair, or to take our seniors to go to the casino that's over in the neighboring state. Closed door service that's not open to the public is considered charter service. It can be done, but there are a lot of rules to follow, and you should make sure that your transit manager is understanding and following the applicable rules. Taking seniors to a congregate meal site when anyone else in town can also ride the bus, totally allowable. But taking seniors, taking a bus out of county to take them to go visit the casino over in Laughlin, Nevada, that's probably going to be considered a charter and might be hard to pull off legally. School bus. FTA has some very persnickety rules about school bus services, which means that your transit vehicle shouldn't be providing closed door service just to school kids, but there are ways that you can arrange for transportation of children. As long as your service is open to everyone else in the community, that's perfectly allowable. So again, these are not black and white issues, but there's just some thorny things there. There's some other stuff around safety and security and asset management that your manager will tell you about. Just suffice to say that there are a lot of rules, and your manager needs to know them. And sometimes a board chair or board president or whatever the person in that role in their board of directors might occasionally be needing to sign off on certifications that the rules are being followed. So you should kind of know what they are before you just sign things. Little reminder, don't ever sign things you don't understand, whether you're a board president or a transit executive. There will be reviews. There will be audits. Everyone who's touched federal funds know that the federal government requires anyone who receives federal funds to comply with a single audit act, which requires financial audits on an annual basis. You kind of take that for granted. Anyone who receives funds from any federal agency knows that that federal agency will do stuff like make sure that its rules are being complied with through reviews and audits. So for instance, in the world of federal transit programs, in urban areas, again, I said those are census designated places with populations over 50,000. FTA has a program that it calls triennial, which means once every 3 years, routine reviews. They're pretty intense and in depth of the transit agencies, and it feels like they're randomly selected, but there's kind of this rolling schedule of places that FTA does its reviews over a 3-year cycle. So your urban transit agencies will get those reviews and audits. For state managed programs, like in rural areas and other smaller, and the rural component of sections 5307 and 5310, the state DOT gets what's called a state management review. Same stuff as what the urban transit systems get, but the review is of the state. What FTA does, I'll just give you a heads up if you're a transit board member from a rural area, is FTA will select, and it will feel random, I'm not sure if it is, they'll select a handful of rural transit systems in that state to go out and see if the state's doing its job. I'll be honest, it's going to feel to the rural transit system like they're being audited. Yeah, not really, they're not. It's the state that's on the hook if there's anything that's not being done right, but still it'll feel pretty rigorous, but it won't be an investing. And those are routine. It's like, that's not because anyone's doing anything wrong. Those are just to be expected. Sometimes FTA will do special reviews. And this is a case where special is probably not good. It's not bad, but it's not good. I've got a lister on the screen. If your transit agency is selected for one of those, it means that FTA has deemed that transit system to be in some kind of risky category, and they want to see. And again, maybe they'll do the review and everything will be explained and no worries. Maybe there'll be some findings that need to be corrected. Maybe there'll be something serious that someone needs to be restricted and no longer allowed to do government service. That's very rare, but FTA will be looking at these things. The safety and drug and alcohol reviews, actually, they do some of those on a random basis. So just sometimes your number gets called, and that's okay. And other federal agencies will also do their own reviews and audits and so forth. So if your agency gets funded through the Administration for Community Living, which is senior services and some programs for people with disabilities, or the Administration for Children and Families, which is a lot of low-income oriented programs, or the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Service, which is Medicaid. Sometimes that's routine, sometimes it's they are looking to investigate. Key thing is, anytime your transit system is being having a review, you as a board member need to know about it. The manager has a responsibility to notify you. You'll be asked to attend some meetings, and you should ask. Don't be shy about asking questions like, what are you asking about? What's up? There shouldn't be any surprises. Key thing, like Scott said in his intro, is as a board member, you do not ever want to be surprised by anything, especially when it's an outside party that represents the federal government looking at things. So I'll just kind of leave that out there. Maybe that's making you nervous. Shouldn't. Most of these things are pretty routine, but the key thing is to keep in mind your role as a board member. First of all, neither you, your manager, or your transit agency as a whole don't ever break any laws. That sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised. You should be empowering and trusting your transit manager. You'll be hearing more about this from my colleagues, but if you don't trust your transit manager, there's a problem, and that needs to be resolved one way or another. Maybe it's a personality conflict that can be worked through. Maybe there's something that's really challenging that's happening there. Whatever, questions should be asked. Try to understand that. You should be expecting the board to be reviewing and adopting policies and key procedures around things. If your transit manager doesn't ask you to do anything other than show up at a meeting, get a report, and then leave, that's a problem. You should actually be, you're the ultimate authorities for policy setting, including financial policies. Someone from your board will need to be involved with financial reviews, budgets, audits, that kind of stuff. If you're not involved with your transit system's finances, you should be. Not to micromanage, but you should be involved. You should be always supportive of your transit manager, especially because one of their jobs is to find those local matching funds that you need to draw down your FTA funds. So when the manager says that they're seeking contract opportunities, you should make sure it's okay. If it's problematic, say so. But also your other question is, how can we as a board help? Or if you can identify sources. So you should be supportive. You should be asking questions. Don't wait till things are about to blow up and explode in your agency's faces. Ask questions when you hear things that maybe you're unfamiliar with, or that don't quite make sense, or that your transit manager is maybe not explaining in a way that you'll quite understand. That's not to say anyone's doing anything bad. Just ask questions, because a board member needs to be understanding of what the agency is doing. And key thing in a key board role is that you are always advocating any way that's allowable. I mean, we're not asking you to be lobbyists or things like that. That's a different function. But you should be advocates with a small a of what your transit system is doing. If you're on the board and you don't believe in the mission of your transit system, I'll let my colleagues later in today and tomorrow explain how to respond to that. We're assuming that the members of boards that oversee transit programs believe in their organization's transit mission, even as they always want to keep making it better and more sustainable. And my final word is sustainability. We don't want to see flash in the pan transit systems that disappear overnight. You should be making sure that your transit system will be an ongoing entity, ongoing service that will grow and serve its community well beyond your term as a member of that transit systems board. So I'm going to leave my contact information there. I have, as my colleagues will attest, paid no attention to what time it is. I think there's time for some questions and answers. So I will let Scott respond with any questions that you might have come to your mind during my presentation. And if you haven't had any questions yet, ask your question in the chat box. There's also a Q&A box, but put it in the chat box, and Scott will look at those. And if there's any that come to mind, he will now share them with me. So I'm all ears, Scott.
Hey, Chris, good, thank you. You covered a lot of ground in just the right time, as I knew you would. And to everyone out there, I think we've been struggling with the closed captioning. I think we need to have set that prior, and we don't want to do something that would shut this down. So can I give you an assurance that tomorrow that will be working and tested and ready to run? And again, apologies for not having that done prior. We have a question. Someone asks, can you please explain in more detail how Medicaid can be used as local match? Randy's in Vermont. We know that the state association is managing the state's Medicaid NEMT contract and been told that Medicaid cannot be used as local match. Can you have some insights on that, Chris?
I will share, I don't know if this will be helpful, but I'll share a couple different things on that. First thing is, if your transit service is funded by the state, then the state gets to set the rules. Good or bad, I'm not going to be the judge, but the state gets to set the rules. So it's not uncommon, even when sometimes we all might like to see it done otherwise, where a state will say, I know FTA says it's allowable, but that's not how we do it in the state. That might be a long-term thing that your transit system, a state transit association, if it's organized, might want to continue working with the state to refine or address or what have you. But that's the thing. Another flip side of that is Medicaid. I know I mentioned it because it is on a nationwide basis, Medicaid is the largest funder of transit operating costs in the country. But that's national, that's not state. Medicaid is really 52 different state-managed Medicaid programs, and every state does things differently. Or one of the things, I'll go slightly off tangential to your question, sometimes states will change how they do their Medicaid programs. And I've seen one state, I have no idea if its transit systems are with us, where a number of years ago, the state totally one year, the state legislature told the state Medicaid agency to change how it did their Medicaid transportation in one legislative session, caught everyone in the transit world by surprise. Poof, a lot of funds kind of evaporated from one year to the next. So state Medicaid agencies will also determine where and how their funds can be used for transportation. The fact that the federal government says it's allowable doesn't mean that it is guaranteed to be that way. It just means it's allowed. So there's a lot of nuances there that will vary from state to state. I will now speak to the question in a slightly more general term for any of these federal human services programs, is that the idea, at least from the FTA perspective, is that the transit system has entered into an agreement, which means that something should be in writing, whether it's a brokerage agreement with a Medicare NEMT broker or a grant or contract with a state or whatever, an agreement in like in Vermont's case through VPTA. There's some kind of document that says that the transit agency will provide transportation for these people under these terms and conditions. Does that sound like a contract? Yeah, it basically is a contract, some kind of agreement. It will be assumed that that contract follows both the transit agency's policies and procedures, as well as all the other parties and procedures. Because from the federal perspective, if a state Medicaid agency or its designee has entered into an agreement following its policies and procedures with a transit agency to provide the non-emergency medical transportation, then that's acceptable to all the parties. It's a reasonably negotiated contract. Rate setting is entirely, that's based on how states do their stuff. So we'll assume that it's all fair and above board. Every now and then someone might get their situation in a pickle because the state didn't quite do things right. But that's a generality. So that's a very general term that also applies to things like Head Start, senior services, vocational rehabilitation, job training, all these things. Like if there's an agreement that is negotiated between the parties according to their policies and procedures, FTA will find it acceptable. The details then remain in the hands of your state and the various state actors involved with that.
Thanks, Chris. I'm gonna freelance a little here because there's a topic that I think you covered 5307, 10, 11, and what those are. And those are formula funding programs, funding that is coming to either a state or to some of our folks directly as part of a formula. Can you give us some insights on how the US Census plays into those formulas and where a board member of a system should be looking at their performance of the system, ridership, coverage, where that plays into how much they're getting in formula funds?
Well, the short answer, and Scott knows that I could spend, and I have spent day-long sessions talking on this topic, so I'll keep it real
True
brief.
enough.
The basic thing is the money is allocated to states and urban areas based on a number of factors that include population is one among many. Interestingly, and this is one of those things that I think comes to a lot of transit board members by surprise, that the number of people taking the bus in your community has very little impact on how much transit money you get. The formulas, urban and rural, are based on a number of other factors, primarily in smaller urban and in rural areas. It's population. For rural areas, it's land area. And I should say that these are for what I'll loosely call rural areas. The money goes to the state. The state then gets to decide who gets how much under what basis. So the fact that it's formula based on what the state get does not mean that it's formula based on what the rural transit system gets themselves. The states make those choices. The small urban program, and this is a little bit in the weeds, but I'll be real brief, for areas between 50,000 and 200,000, almost all those funds are allocated on the basis of urban areas, populations, and population density without, even if there's no transit system. I'll just name a place because I happened to do a little bit of work with them a while back. Valdosta, Georgia, from 1964 to 2000, and it was, I think, right before the pandemic. I'll say 2020. For what is it? That's a lot of years, for decades, literally many decades. Valdosta, Georgia, area of about 76,000 population, always got a transit apportionment, and they never, for all those decades, had a public transit program. Georgia Department of Transportation took those funds with some others for areas that didn't have public transit and redistributed them to other places that did. It wasn't like it stood in a bank vault for decades waiting to be tapped into. So the states get to make some choices there. For urban areas, I will mention as an outlier because it was one of the places where I grew up. So the Los Angeles area had the direct recipient is Los Angeles County. There are in the Los Angeles urban area 140 public transit providers. The formula allocation to Los Angeles is based on what all the systems did, but then LA Metro and local officials determine how to split those funds up locally. So there's a lot of local decision making in urban areas, a lot of state-based decision making in state areas. Every 10 years, census recalibrates what's urban and what's not urban. There are some places that are getting some surprises these days. And again, I did a whole webinar on this for CTAA several months ago. I can happily talk offline with anyone who has a question. I'll just pick on one place as an example. Henderson, Kentucky, for 20 years was part of the Evansville, Indiana urban area. So Henderson Area Transit System, one of our members, was a small municipal transit system that happened to be part of a, quote, large urban area. And they would get their funds as a share of what went to Evansville, Illinois. Well, Indiana rather. And then in this most recent census decided that the Evansville, Indiana urban area stopped at the Ohio River, did not cross into Kentucky. Henderson, Kentucky now has to be a rural public transit provider getting its share of 5311 funds from the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. That creates an interesting challenge, separate topic for a different time, but there will be some of you that are probably part of transit systems that will be affected in one way or another. It might be good, it might be bad, it might just be different based on some census determinations.
Chris, and now that we've opened the can on census, we have a very good question which says, could you please talk a little bit about census tracts that are underserved and kind of how a board member should be interpreting that?
There are a lot of ways you could go there, and I'll keep it fairly simple. Two things. One is no one is requiring a transit system to provide a route to a place just because people live there. Transit routes, especially in fixed route service, are a precious commodity, and presumably you've got some expertise that decides the bus runs there, because the moment the bus runs there, that means it's not going to go over there. So you need to decide, where's the bus going to run? Obviously, there's a mission in public transit of serving people that need public transit. That's a decision point to be made. Sometimes that means that areas might, and I know FTA sometimes puts out a definition. It's not a legally binding one in my opinion, but that's just my opinion, of what an underserved census tract means. It doesn't mean you have to go run a bus out there right now. It does mean that you might get some preferential treatment for a little side pot of money that FTA hands out on a competitive basis for areas of persistent poverty. There might be, it's good to know where the underserved areas in your area are, but you don't have the obligation to serve them. Flip side of that is civil rights. Everyone has to comply with the Civil Rights Act, but in transit, some things are unique. And if you're a transit system whose bus routes are only serving people of a certain race and not available to people of another race, that's a problem. Even if it was not designed intentionally to be that way, that's a problem. Similarly, if you make transit very inconvenient for people of a certain race and not for others, you got an issue on your hands there. Again, is there a right or wrong answer? I don't know, but there's an issue. So sometimes these things play in different ways, but everything would then have to be looked at on a place-by-place, system situation. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution for how to serve the people in America that most need transit.
And Craig, further to that question, if you need more detail, email me or Chris directly. And as you can tell, Chris can speak in more than into the weeds on census stuff. Chris, while we're on transit, and I mean that's the first part of this, is the baselines for transit for the board members participating. I thought I would raise a couple of issues. One, we have the honor of working with transit systems all over the country. And so we're seeing at CTAA trends that you may be seeing at your agencies in your communities. And what are some of those? And I thought I'd raise that, when we're working with our members directly at meetings with large groups of our members, for the most part, the two things that are top of mind are, one, the difficulty finding drivers. That's probably a difficulty at your agency. It's a difficulty nationally. Second is the difficulty and the expense and the time it takes to replace rolling stock in vehicles, far beyond what we were used to pre-pandemic. Those two issues, just for the board members here when we're talking transit, whether it's our largest systems or running fixed routes, or our smallest agencies that are doing some demand response for people with disabilities and older adults, those two challenges are ones that we're constantly working on here in DC, trying to improve upon, but they're ones that a lot of our systems are seeing. I wanted to share that. Chris, there's a piece too that each system, when it pulls down federal funds, there's these certifications and assurances that have to be provided to the federal government. Where do you think a board member, how much should a board member know about that? Is that something that they need to be aware of? Where does that fall, you think?
Oops, I didn't mean to hit that. Well, for one, yes, there are certifications and assurances. And typically, and again, in a state managed program, the state does that. So for a lot of systems, you might not even be aware that these things are applied. And I would actually say, Scott, that's the more touchy situation where and basically for those board members that don't know what we're talking about, it's about 20 pages of, if you printed it out, tiny type, kind of the size of printing that back when we all had telephone books, the phone books were printed in. Really fine print, very legalistic stuff that says we will, and the transit manager, the accountable agency executive, transit manager, or for state managed programs, someone from the State Department of Transportation, is basically checking the boxes that apply to that entity. It says, we won't do this, we won't do this, we will do this, we agree to this. Lots of fine print. Basically, they are the terms and conditions of federal funding to the transit system. And if you ever want to know what they are, you can go to the Federal Transit Administration website. That's transit.dot.gov. Do a search on their website. You'll actually see all this language. It's out there. There's no secrets. And it is. It's a lot of grant related, but agency specific legalistic language. Basically, I will simplify that to say, go back to that bullet point now that I know how to go back. The first bullet point I had on this slide, don't break any laws. Your transit manager, or for state programs, your state Department of Transportation has basically agreed to a whole bunch of stuff that says that neither the entity nor its subrecipients are going to break any laws. So you've got a bit of a responsibility as a board member to kind of know what those are. I would say that if your transit manager is taking the time, even though it might feel tedious to them and to you, to explain what you have to comply with, that's time well spent, because you don't want to just assume that the federal government doesn't know what they're talking about and they're making these things up. No, they're there. They're all grounded in actual federal statute most of the time. So I would say that there is a duty to inform. I would say this probably ties more back into what Bill will be sharing with you in a little bit. That the transit manager has a duty to inform you of not just the problems that are arising, but also what do we have to do here? So I'll put those in that category. And if you're in a system that gets your funds from an indirect source, whether it's the State Department of Transportation or you're a subrecipient, like 142 of those 143 systems in LA, you're a subrecipient to LA Metro for your funds, or you're a 5310 senior services provider, like I was on the board of for a while, that gets their funds from a planning agency. In any case, you need to know that there are rules and what they are that apply to you. So it's good to ask some questions, especially if this is something that we're raising now that you're hearing for the very first time. You might want to just ask the questions and make sure you're comfortable with the answer you get. And if you don't like the answer, then come back to us and say, what's my manager talking about? We'll explain it to you, and then hopefully everything will be fine.
Chris, last question. And to Craig's comment about how difficult it is on drivers, we're going to include a link to the training that Karen Souza on our team has done. She'll be training tomorrow as part of this, but we've got a video-based presentation on driver recruitment and retention with a lot of great ideas that some of our members have deployed and found useful. I think Taylor's going to be sharing that link shortly. Chris, on the last question, when we're looking at when you work with agencies like you have all around the country, what do you look for when you say for an effective board from a transit perspective?
What I keep an eye out for are transit board members, first and foremost, that know what their agency does. I have visited some places where they show up for meetings. Maybe there's some nice conversation. They get a nice report. Maybe they're asked to vote on a thing or two. All hands go up, blah, blah, blah. And then they'll go home and they don't have any idea what they were talking about. That's never good. You should know what your agency does. That's number one. You should be curious about what your agency can do better. That's number two. You should got to be involved with any major decisions your transit manager is making. Not the minor ones, stay out of those, but you should be involved with the major decisions. Policy setting, goal setting, executing major agreements with funding sources. Even if you don't have to sign them, you should at least know what they are. You should be honoring policies and procedures. The biggest problem I've seen with problem-plagued transit systems is when neither the board nor the executive are actually following their own policies and procedures. Sometimes they don't make sense to me as an outsider. There's one agency I'm doing a lot of work with. It's a very high-performing agency, no problems with them. Every single contract has to be signed by a board president at a meeting that they have but once a month. To me, that sounds like a bit much, but it works for them and it's what their policies do. If that's the policy, follow the policy. Don't make up your own rules because you find the policy awkward. So taking shortcuts and those the others. And ask questions. There's one system I worked with that actually went out of business because they had a lot of negative findings in their FTA reviews. Some of them pretty darn serious. And the transit board, none of those board members, I went to some of their meetings, they would never ask a question of the manager, even like, oh, I heard that someone from FTA was going to be in town this week. What's that about? And the board member, the trans manager, I remember I was at a board meeting doing board training, shaking my head in disbelief. The trans manager says, "Oh, don't worry about that." No, worry. I said, worry. And well, anyway, so those are some of my key thoughts. But I'm sure that throughout the when Bill's sharing with you right after this, and then again when you've got Kristen and Karen tomorrow, that's what similar points are going to be from my colleagues as well. Is you've got to be engaged. Don't be overbearing. Don't be micromanaging. But by golly, be engaged.
Thanks, Chris. That's a great way to end your session. Appreciate your time and expertise. And I'm sure we'll be everyone out there. If you saw Chris's email, fire questions as you think Chris can handle for you. While Bill McDonald takes control of the screen and puts his session up, I'll introduce Bill. Bill is currently a board member at our organization, the Community Transportation Association of America. Twice he served as the chair of our board. Bill is also a current board member of RTS, a mid-sized urban operation in Rochester, New York. Prior to that, and by the way, all those things I've been talking about are what Bill has done in his, and I'm going to use very loosely, retirement. Prior to that, Bill was the general manager and executive director of medical motor services located in Rochester, New York, doing a lot of non-emergency medical transportation. Bill's worked with the United Way, and on our board, Bill has always been one to remind us about the forms that good governance and good board governance takes. And so I couldn't think of a better person to talk about that issue and speak to purposes and practices. So welcome, Bill. The session is yours, and thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. And it's great to be here. I think what you're pointing out is that I'm not very good at retirement, but I keep trying. I did retire actively running an organization, transportation agency, about 7 years ago, but I've been active on boards and governance since then, and also some direct service. I'm proud to say I think I've been a member of CTAA from the very beginning as a charter member, I think in 1989. And so when Scott was talking about Chris and him, how long they've been there, I think I'd known them from the very time that they started, and Karen as well. So again, thank you for having me here, and I really appreciate this opportunity. Now I got to, whoops. I got to figure out how to move this. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So today, the purpose of the presentation to go over is some of it's been touched on very, very well by Chris earlier, but to really talk about what are the common responsibility and duties of boards, whether they are public or nonprofit. And there are some differences between the two, but there's enough similarities that can share these, the focus and the responsibilities. Primarily the non-for-profit organizations, voluntary organizations, they're called voluntary organizations because the board is really volunteers versus a private for-profit whose purpose is really shareholders that they're accountable to and producing profits. And that can be in the transportation sector as well. But in the nonprofit sector, you have volunteer directors running it. There are no profits that accrue to them. They go back into the operation itself. And so that's one of the main distinctions also in terms of the certification by IRS or the state local charities organization that gives them the ability to operate. Certainly today's transit organizations are very complex, and we talked a little bit about some of those challenges, internal and external, that are facing them. And that includes post-COVID ridership issues. We're up to about 80% in Rochester from pre-COVID. demographic changes in a community. You have a larger demographic of older adults that have different mobility needs, perhaps. There's new mobility options in the community that transit agencies have to collaborate and work with, whether it's, the ride share or bike share opportunities that are out there. So there's a lot of things going on in the environment. Also hope to provide some example of practices. There's policies and then there's practices. And I feel pretty strong and proud of the work that's done in Rochester. So I'm going to be sharing some examples of what we do in the governance area that perhaps you can take with you. And there are some handouts that will be available to you. And then I hope to hear a little bit about your ideas or questions that you might have about governance. And really the ultimate goal here is to make all of our boards high functioning, collaborative, and effective. I thought I'd share just some things I've observed about boards over the years. And I've been involved in transportation for 40+ years as an operator, as I mentioned, but also in terms of policy and governance. And not just transportation boards, but other boards as well. Boardrooms are really often filled with people of good intentions. I think that's a good starting point. People are there because they want to make a difference and they believe in it. The competencies, however, of board members can be very varied, and you get a lot of different skills. Sometimes they complement each other. Sometimes people are in there for different motivations, but so it's very, very different. I have found that boards tend to go towards the conservative and risk adverse nature of things because they want to protect the agency. And I'm not sure that's always a positive thing, especially if you have a CEO as well that's very risk adverse. I found that boards really don't like to hire and fire CEOs. That's one of those things, like when the CEO announces that they're leaving, it's like, oh, they have to go through this whole process. What process are they going to use? And that's why we have in our governance responsibilities on the board that I'm on to lay out, and Karen's going to talk more about this. What is the succession policies that should be followed so that you know about this ahead of time? A passive board who relies too much on a CEO can be manipulated, and that can lead to disasters. As Chris pointed out, on the other hand, meddling boards can really mess things up as well. So the sweet spot is to stay at a high level in terms of policy and practices of governance without getting too much in the weeds, but also being independent. It's good to have turnover and term limits of board members. It's good to have people that have been there with provide some legacy, and also to have some fresh and new voices on the board. What I've learned about being on a board is you have to be vigilant. You have to insist on reports being tied to metrics. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and what are some metrics that we use. You need to challenge executives when there are concerns, and you need to stay focused on the mission, the vision, and the outcomes. Because being on a board is really meaningful, impactful work, and I have always viewed it as a privilege and an honor. And I don't know why I'm having trouble getting to these next slides. So why have boards, and what's the purpose of governance? I've heard from more than one person who comes from the private sector, especially, and becomes a leader in a nonprofit board or a public board, that they don't really always understand what the purpose of the board is, especially if they're a middle management in a private sector organization. Why are they necessary? They seem like a hassle to deal with. Fundamentally, boards are, in some cases, public boards are mandated by the government. The Rochester Transit System, for example, is a public benefit corporation and a unit of New York State government. It was created in 1969. It took over because there was a private for-profit company running it, and they could no longer sustain themselves. They weren't able to make a sufficient profit. They weren't able to generate the kind of income that they needed. We actually had a subway in Rochester at one time that went defunct in the late 1950s because it couldn't be managed. So the government took it over, the state took it over with the understanding that it's a public benefit and therefore deserving of and entitled to public support to make it sustainable. But boards exist to assure that the organization works to achieve its mission. In our case, the mission in Rochester Transit is to provide, quote, to provide vital, safe, and sustainable transportation that connects the community and promotes a better quality of life. Well, you know, like many mission statements, how do you measure that? How do you measure that you're promoting a better quality of life, that you're connecting the community? But that tends to be typical of missions. They're very broad and they're aspirational. So secondly, boards work to assure that the entity serves the need and goals of the stakeholders. Now, stakeholders can include ridership, obviously, employees, businesses, schools, and in the case of public entities, for sure, taxpayers and government bodies. When we talk about riders, it's really important, I think, for boards of public transit or even nonprofit transportation organizations to understand who their ridership is and to get data about that. I was surprised to find out when I asked in Rochester, you know, what is the makeup of our ridership besides what I see on the buses? And we do on-bus surveys of riders to get their feedback on the quality of the service, the safety of it, the cleanliness of it. And we also get some demographic information. And we found out in a report that the majority of the ridership are young people, not real surprising there, between 18 and 29. But what surprised me is 35% are over the age of 50. And I think a lot of people don't think about older adults riding public transit. They think, oh, they're afraid of public transit and so on. In Rochester, 70, 80% of the ridership is either young adults or older adults. They tend to be poor. Their household income is under $15,000 for 52% of them. Vast majority reside in the city. Now, the Rochester Transit System is an 8-county system that's made up of both rural and urban. So the board is comprised of members who represent these different areas, but the vast majority of riders are really from the city. The vast majority of riders are non-white. The vast majority of riders use transit to get to work first and then medical second. So as a board member, it's important to know who's using your system, why they're using it, and knowing who uses it helps you understand what some of their needs might be. The third purpose, of course, is to be an efficient steward, an effective steward too, of the agency's assets and resources. More of these fiduciary responsibilities are going to be covered tomorrow, but I'm going to touch on some of them today as well, provided I can get my slides to move then in a way that I hope I can. The fourth is to increase the public trust and confidence. You know, we as board members represent this entity when we're out in the public. And so we have an obligation to garner public support because in some cases, not so much in New York State, but I know in Michigan and other states, the public can actually vote for money through taxes or millages to support public transit. So having a public body that is trustworthy and that the public has confidence in is very paramount. And a high performing transit system is going to justify that kind of support, even though we know that ridership is a challenge, and even though we know that recruiting drivers is a challenge, we always want to have a continuous improvement of our service so we get the public's trust. The fifth is assuring the entity's sustainability, and Chris mentioned this too. The leadership of a transit organization may change, but the board structure represents a continuation of the corporation and its interests. So boards are responsible to develop strategies to make the transit agency services relevant and to ensure that their operations and management is responsive and competent, and that it has the ability to continue going forward. Oh, I'm so happy I got that to change without a hassle there, the slide. So first I'm going to cover the three primary duties of a board member: duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of oversight. In terms of duty of care, it can become easy to defer to a strong executive. We get that. Many of us probably know of agencies that have hit a crisis point when they've been surprised by the information that they're getting when it's too late. And sometimes the crisis was too far along to salvage it and maybe cause damage to its reputation. And I know Chris touched on this, Scott knows of these Unfortunately, there are examples out there. So the duty of care then is for board members being informed, making decisions based on material that you are being provided and that you're asking for that material as well that you feel that you need. You have to exercise independent judgment and act in good faith, be honest. And actually, how you do these things, there's a process to it, and it's not complicated, but surprisingly, not everyone adheres to this. Attend meetings. It's important to be present at the table. Request information if you don't have enough to make a decision. Chris mentioned this, I'm going to say it. I ask a lot of questions. I probably ask too many questions sometimes on boards that I've been on, but so they have to be reasonable questions, but make sure that you aren't sitting there uncertain of something and feel that, you know, you can't ask a question, because 9 times out of 10, other people have the same question. And then there's the common sense rule, and it's really kind of a business judgment rule that we should take comfort in as board members, which is, as long as you've been engaged and you've been asking questions and you've been involved in it, and you have records and documentation that show that these deliberations have happened, you can survive a bad decision, because we can't always make good decisions, but we have to make them based on something solid. And lacking that, you are open to criticism and perhaps even some legal responsibility if you're really making decisions in an uninformed manner. So that's important. But another important point is to, once a decision is made by the board, to support that decision. Sometimes it's difficult to do that when you hold an opposing point of view. And I'll give you an example that's public information, but in terms of Rochester, a couple of years ago, we went through this whole planning process to develop what we called Reimagine RTS, which was a reconfiguration of our service in a couple of different ways. Frequent service, 15-minute service on 10 of the 30 routes that we had, on-demand service in certain zones of the county that were underserved with fixed transit, but we felt we could provide an on-demand alternative to that. So we were all ready to go with this decision that we made based on, you know, retreats that we had and planning sessions. And lo and behold, the city school district in Rochester faced a crisis of transportation of their students. This was about 2 years ago when we were launching our Reimagine. And, you know, we have a limited supply of buses, a limited supply of drivers. And the board was faced with a decision that they had to make under pressure from the governor to divert some of the improvements that we were going to make into meeting this basic need of getting city school kids to their high schools, doing it in a way that's legal, by the way. Chris will be happy to know that the routes are open to the public, but nonetheless, they go to the schools, and they had to increase the number of buses that were available to do that. Well, I had a lot of problems with that. We had made the decision to reimagine our system, and now we're being faced with an external crisis that required a new decision to be made by the board. But and I argued that, are we here to serve the general public, or are we here to serve specific groups within that in terms of school children? The decision was to meet the needs of the school children, because that was critical for their academic success, obviously, to get to school, and also to support children in our city. So once that decision was made, I had to be, you know, faithful to that decision and support that decision. And that's just an example of a collaborative decision-making process that you have the opportunity to express your opinions about things. But in the end, even if the decision isn't one that you voted for, a good functioning board, a collaborative board, is going to support it, you know, the final decision that's made. Duty of loyalty and good faith. Here is where we get into issues like conflict of interest, that prohibiting people from board members from seeking personal financial benefits by being on a board, and disclosing those interests through a transparent process, which is usually, you know, by declaring on an annual form that's completed on a conflict of interest form. And, you know, having a conflict is not a fatal flaw to be on a board. The failure is not disclosing it. And the failure is to, if you were to participate in a decision where your interests are involved, that's a flaw. But if you declare your conflict and not vote on matters where there's a conflict, that's usually viewed as a very acceptable way to deal with that. Because, you know, in some communities, if you prohibited board members from being on a board because they might have a conflict in all these different areas, whether it's insurance sales or product sales or HR services or whatever it might be, you might have a hard time finding somebody to be on the board. The other thing is, it's sort of like going to Vegas. What happens in a boardroom stays in a boardroom. You know, our meetings are public, so they're filmed and open to the public. We can't have a meeting that is held behind closed doors where there's a group of board members discussing something. So that helps in terms of the transparency part. I want to say that, you know, you can't serve two masters when you're on a board. A lot of times people are like, well, I'm on this board representing X constituency. And it's true. You may be able to reflect that voice of that constituency, but you have to be faithful to the entity that you are on the board of. That's who you serve, and that's who your loyalty has to be with. The duty of oversight, we've talked a little bit before, and we'll be talking more tomorrow, but again, what does this mean? It means monitoring the activities of management and staff. It means providing policy direction consistent with the mission. And if you have legislation that has created your body, your organization. And here it's important to avoid mission creep with new programs where sometimes something may seem attractive to get into, but is it really consistent with your mission? And you have to defer from that. Now, sometimes you may, some organizations create subsidiary organizations, even for-profit arms in some instances, to whether it's a foundation or et cetera. We have a couple of foundations at the regional transit system, but they're not inconsistent with the mission of what we do. Everyone knows that board members develop and approve policies, and many of those policies are required by law. So you are really incumbent on you to know and be informed about what are the laws. And sometimes they're changing all the time in the case of HR policies. But even though the state or the feds may say you have to do this in terms of an HR policy, you still need to incorporate it into your policy manual, and you still need the board to approve that in terms of its application, you know, to your entity. And typically boards set an amount of money where they would allow staff to purchase goods and services, capital items, without getting board approval. And there's a couple ways you can do this. One is by setting an amount that is low enough not to get you into a lot of trouble, but also high enough that you're not getting an agenda filled with a gazillion different purchase items. So for example, the range is typically $75,000 to $125,000. It probably depends on your organization. And I think we're about 125 now. But the exception to that is if there's a procurement that's done through state contract, where it's already been bid out and followed state procurement policies, where we become aware that was purchased off state contract. We still approve that purchase off state contract, but the rigmarole that the management has to go through to enable that or purchase that or enable that contract is already really kind of taken care of by the state procurement policies. Overseeing internal controls and overseeing the activities of the external auditors. So you should meet with the auditors. You should have an audit committee. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But when you meet with the auditors, you should meet with them separate from management. And I think most people are aware of that and do that now because you really want to have a confidential, open, you tell me what's going on. You know, that can be an executive session, by the way. That doesn't have to be open to the public. That is allowable to do some of those meetings in executive session. You really want to get the truth about, you know, how are the books? How are their internal control processes? are the statements accurate that we've been getting? And that's a responsibility of all board members, not just the finance committee folks. But it becomes then, how do we shift into management oversight in general? And what does that mean? It means that we ensure that the agency's conduct is legal. You know, it was mentioned before, don't do anything illegal, and don't do anything immoral either. Make sure that you're ethically appropriate. It's your job to provide active oversight of the management and make the reasonable inquiries about activities where appropriate. And you don't have to get in the weeds, but on, you know, big items, how is it going for recruitment? What are we doing to get drivers to deal with this process? How, you know, what are some ideas that we can talk about to help management do that? It's also important to support management, not just view that, oh, we have to review them and do a performance evaluation, but you really want to have a good relationship with your CEO and your executive team, because they're the doers, they're the implementers, and you have to have trust with them and have a good positive relationship. Obviously, hiring the chief executive and evaluating their performance is one of the fundamental roles of the board. And quite honestly, boards often fall short on that. They let it go, they let it lapse. Sometimes a board, an executive director will be like, gee, it's been 1.5 years since I've had my review. Come on, board, what's going on here? So it's important to stay on top of that. And I have some examples of that will be available online, a tool that we use to evaluate our CEO on an annual basis. And the form is created and you adjust it every year. So it's kind of a no-brainer, but you have to implement it and have all the board members. In our case, we have all the board members fill out this evaluation. Understanding the difference between oversight and meddling, the chief executive is totally responsible for implementation of policies and strategies and oversight of staff. The oversight of staff, you know, that gets tricky for some board members because they're like, oh, I don't like that person, or I don't think that person's doing a good job, or we need to get rid of that person. And you really have to be careful with that. I remember when I was a CEO of the nonprofit transportation agency, had a board, of course, and the board chairman at the time talked to me about, we're not really too happy with the financial reports that we're getting. You know, what's going on with your CFO, and is he really suitable for the job? And so I gave that some thought and I ended up making a change, but I didn't make the change because I was ordered to do it. I made the change because the board member helped me sort of understand and see that, gee, there really is kind of a problem here. And that's okay. It would be inappropriate for the board member to come in and criticize the CFO in that case, say that they want to evaluate them or order the CEO to do something. Except, of course, if there's something that's illegal or immoral that has happened, then you may have to step in as a board member. But you really have to, you know, take the advice of board members, but you as the executive, in the case of management, makes the final decision on staff. So board members should not be meddling in how the director runs his or her organization. But the management has an obligation to keep the board informed on sufficient information around what are issues of concern, what are the risks that the organization is facing, what are the liabilities, because all of that, it's not a question of shame by the CEO, it's a question of getting help and having the board be able to deliberate and maybe come up with some solutions, make some intelligent decisions. That gets into, of course, financial oversight, which is going to be a subject tomorrow, but it is part of the governance responsibility. So I want to touch on it briefly here, that it is one of the major responsibilities of the board, and that to oversee the financial condition of the organization. They need to understand what it is. It's good to know the funding sources that we've talked about, and what they're buying with those funding sources, what programs are provided through those funding sources, and that they should get regular financial reports monthly, really, if you're meeting monthly at a board meeting. And when you get those reports, don't let your eyes gloss over, but look at the detail, ask questions about it, and make your own decisions, because ultimately, the board is responsible to approve a budget, both a capital budget and an operating budget. And I know the board that I'm on, we don't always rely just on management's recommendation when it comes to some budget areas. And then we want to know how the agency's performing compared to what that approved budget was. And so adjustments can be made if they need to. How many board committees should there be when you talk about governance? It really, there's people that say less is better. More gets too complicated and burns people out. It also depends on the size of your board, depends maybe on the size of your organization. Sometimes it depends on the size of the budget, but not always. I had more committees with running a nonprofit that was in the $10 to $15 million range budget versus the transit authority that I'm on the board of that has about $120 million budget. And we have less committees. And those committees that we have are basically, we have executive committee members, we have governance committee, we have the compensation committee, and we have the audit committee. And sometimes, and they work together. I'm chair of the governance committee. And, when we were replacing our CEO, the governance committee came up with what should the process be to do that. But then it went over to the compensation committee, who actually acted to replace the CEO, the selection committee and interview committee. So they do work together. Compensation committee determines how much are you going to pay the CFO and executive officers, and is involved in succession planning, as I just mentioned. The audit committee obviously oversees accounting and financial reporting processes, financial statements. Sometimes they're combined. The audit might even be combined with an investment committee, because boards have some responsibility, they have responsibility to determine how should any surplus funds, not profits, but surplus funds, be invested if you have them. I'm going to focus on the governance committee, though, specifically today, of course, and their these purposes are taken from our charter of the committee. And I recommend, this isn't the case in a lot of boards, but having a charter for every committee is work to create it, but it provides a kind of guidance to the members of the committee in terms of what's the purpose of the committee, how does it function, what is its authority and responsibilities, how frequently should it meet, who should be in it, what is it comprised of. So having committees and clarity about the purpose of them are important. As far as governance go, generally speaking, we say we want to keep our board informed of best practices and reviewing industry governance trends. And that's where CTAA is so important, has been important to me as a member, because we become aware of trends through CTAA. And for example, fare policies. The previous session talked a little bit about fares. I'm someone who's raising that question on our board in terms of an upcoming retreat. What are the pros and cons of having fares, and should we consider getting rid of them? We've held our fares to $1 for one ticket for one ride, and to $56 for an unlimited monthly ride pass. For years now, we haven't changed it. But when I ride the bus, I see some people struggling to come up with even that. And I wonder, knowing who we serve and the population that's using our service, would we be able to get more ridership by eliminating fares? And would that be offset by any kind of revenue that we might get in terms of mileage and passenger rides? And we provide about 8 million rides a year. I don't know if I mentioned that. So that would be one. On-demand service, we did a lot of study on that in terms of trends in the community, the industry about that, to look at it, and we implemented that. Zero emissions is a big one. We're kind of leading the pack in some ways in New York State. In Rochester, we have we have diesel buses. We have vehicles that are gasoline, unleaded fuel. We have electric buses now. We have 20 of those, and we decided this climate isn't going to work. So now we're going into hydrogen cell buses as well. So it's like, sometimes you are a pilot for other entities, but sometimes you can learn from other providers, other transit systems, in our industry, what worked for you, what didn't work for you, and why. Another role for the governance committee, and this gets a little tricky depending on your situation, but to advise applicable governmental bodies who are responsible for appointing the director. What are you looking for? What would be a skill set that might be helpful to have? We have a variety of skill sets on our board. The challenge for us is that each of the member counties, the city and the county, in the case of our authority, Rochester appoints or recommends to the governor people to be on the board, and then the member counties do the same. The governor really decides. They have to get two options. She decides who's going to be on the board, and then it has to be approved by the Senate. That's a lot more complicated than, say, a nonprofit transportation agency, where typically the board itself is the membership that elects, or the authority that elects a board member. So this idea is still the same between the two, which is, what are we looking for? What skills do we need? What representation do we need to be on the board? And then finally, the governance committee is responsible to formulate, propose policies for honest and ethical conduct. And examples would be, conflict of interest policy, whistleblower policies, appeals processes. And all of these different policies are assigned to be kept. Somebody's got to keep track of it on the staff level, because, you get into all kinds of policies around code of ethics, compensation committee, planning, debt policy, audit committee charters, all of the charters. So it's important to have staff assigned to monitor these policies. And every year, there's a quick review by staff and the governance committee. Are these policies still good? Are they still relevant? Do we need to make any changes? And you do rely on legal counsel for a lot of that, and knowledgeable people on staff to do that, depending on the size of your organization. But that's an important work for the governance committee. I should also say that not on here is informing and advising the CEO regarding community risks and opportunities is an important obligation, I think, of boards and governments. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the practices that we have that have been very useful. And really, on the many boards that I've been on, and I don't get paid to say this by Rochester, but I think we have really some good best practices in place right now. And some of it is, kind of common sense, but do you really do it? For example, the annual performance review of the CEO, I have a sample that you'll be getting that includes, what are the kind of questions you ask to evaluate the CEO in terms of his performance. Things like how does he relate to the board? How does he manage things financially? Is he good in terms of his leadership and development of the management team? Does he have a good relationship with the communities that we serve? Does he have a good relationship with the board itself? In our case, it's a he. Does he exceed expectations, meet them, need improvement, or I don't have enough information to answer the question? That's an option for board members. Want to know, are we results oriented? Do we have good goals? Are we really willing to take risks and foster innovation and creative thinking? Again, I mentioned earlier on, there's a risk aversion sometimes with boards. Got to be careful about that, because you want to be able to take risks, because we have to always be moving forward in terms of what our plans are and how we're meeting the community's needs. What's the work ethic of the CEO, and so on. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's about 20 some areas, and then there's opportunity for overall comments to make. Also, and this is something that I had never done on a board, is an annual self-assessment of the board itself. Every board member, is asked to complete a not terribly long, but still relevant survey of themselves. Do they feel that they understand the mission of the organization? Do they feel like they're getting all of the financial information they need? Does the CEO communicate with them? Are they involved in planning, and so on? So I have an example of that, and we use the self-assessment results, where people say, I'm not really sure what this means that I'm supposed to, represent the authority in the community. I don't know what that means. So if even one or two people say that, we then consider, some training for the board on that, or part of our annual retreat, which, by the way, we have an annual retreat. And this retreat is an opportunity, and a day-long thing. Have it a good place that has good food and good refreshments and comfortable seats. Bring in outside speakers that can talk about some of these trends. For example, zero emissions, what's going on there, or other mobility issues that are new in the community, and really delve into those. The opportunity for the board to set some goals and strategies for the future, and then assess that retreat. Was it helpful? What did people say about that? And then finally provide recommendations for the board on using all of that, how we can orientate new board members better to improve their performance, and be clear about what the expectation of board members are. And then we have a charter for the governance committee. I included a sample that will be online of our charter for that, as I said before, kind of lists what are the purposes, what are the things that the committee should be looking at and doing. So these are kind of simple stuff, but they, at least in my case, not often practiced in a lot of the boards. And also, having performance measures. We spend a lot of time talking about this. And in fact, we have a system called the TOP system, which is our word for that is a Transportation Organization Performance Scorecard. And every month we get a report from the CEO at our board meeting in terms of these 4 strategic pillars. Where do we stand? Financial sustainability, which ultimately is, where are we on net income? It's the bottom line issue, right? Are we going to have a deficit? Are we going to have a surplus? Are we on target with the budget? So these are all weighted, and they change over the course of the year in terms of what might be highlighted more than others. Because when you do customer satisfaction measurements and net promoter scores and onboard customer surveys, we don't do that every quarter. We do that, I think, twice a year. So that reaches a higher level of percentage concern depending on when they were done. We've decided that on-time performance is one of the key measurements for our public transit system. And I'll talk a little bit more briefly about what that means, but that's one of the pillars for our top scoring, our strategic pillar. And then the 4th one is employee engagement and satisfaction. Are they involved? We offer many activities for our employees. Are they engaged in them? What do they value in them? And also surveying them, what is important to them? And we're learning, as you all are, who are either management or board members, burnout is becoming a big issue. It isn't always about pay. Pay is pretty good. Benefits tend to be good in public sector transit, but not always. People could argue about that, but sometimes what's more important is the work environment, the stress that they're under in terms of deadlines and shortage of drivers, and if there's equipment issues, et cetera. So it's important. Those are the 4 pillars that we, at a very high level, we think are important. But then we also have more than this, but these are just some samples of some service goals that the board has approved, and sometimes says, I want to hear more about this one or that one, or add this one or that one. What does it mean to be on time? You got to define these goals in terms of how you're going to measure it. And we get a lot of data. There's a lot of ways to track data in a transit system. But you have to know what you're tracking and what does it mean to be on time. So we define that. You're not too early, not too late. And we want to meet that 88% of the time. We exceed that, by the way, that goal of 88% on time performance. And we're in the 90s in some of our properties or some of our counties, even higher or lower than 98%. Being too early is a problem in transit. Having clean buses, not passing up customers too much in terms of, if there's a lot of people at a bus stop and your bus is full, those are the good old days and a lot of times. But Do you have another bus that's coming within 5 minutes to pick up that overflow? Or are you passed up and left people stranded? And when you don't have frequent service, this is a very big issue. And like I said, we have some routes with 15-minute service and some we don't yet, but I hope we get back to that. Missing trips, like if the whole route is missed, driver doesn't show up, bus breakdown, whatever it might be, one leg either from the transit center to the end of the run or from the end of the run back to the transit center. We obviously have a very small percentage of where that occurs. And then we do surveys in terms of customer service by bus operators, and then net promoter scores for customer service itself. For those, we hire outside entities to do these customer surveys and onboard surveys and interviews. So let me just end with saying that I'm grateful I've been able to move the slides through the whole thing and not get jammed up like I did in the beginning. But being a director on a board is not just something that you do to build your resume or because it's, you know, oh, look at me. It's really a real job, and it's an important job. And we do it because it makes a difference in our community, and good governance leads to good service and good management and good results, I think. So that is my story. And if anyone wants to contact me, that's my email.
Hey, thanks, Bill. And you may have had a couple of issues with the slides, but this is going to be a Zoom meeting where no one, knock on wood, has had to do the, oh, you're on mute. So, you know, we've done well.
Yes.
And a lot of good information. A couple of questions that I wanted to share with you. I know that Kristen, who's going to be teaching tomorrow, has been answering some of these. And thank you, Kristen. We appreciate that. One person asked, you know, what kind of, you mentioned a couple of committees, but what are other typical or common committees beyond just executive and finance?
Sure.
You know, you mentioned governance. Are there any others?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned, you know, governance, compensation, audit, but other ones that are typical are a finance committee, for example, that is called a finance committee and meets monthly. We don't have a finance committee, we have an audit committee, and we get the finance report. So a finance committee. Some people have program committees where they get reports on a monthly basis or less frequently, you know, what are the services that are going on. Some have strategic planning committees that function at certain times of the year. The governance committee in our case operates as really the strategic planning committee because we organize the retreat and the development of that plan. The plan, which is created every year, by the way, updated every year in our system. HR committee, sometimes, you know, transit systems will have a separate committee for that. So it really, you know, it's varied. And I was kind of surprised we only had a few. And I've heard people say you should have less rather than more, but I think you should have what you think you need for good governance.
Yeah, it's a good point. Every system is going to be a little different, but as long as those committees are serving, and I liked your idea that you shared about having a charter that really speaks to purpose, as long as they're serving an effective purpose and effectively, then they're probably good. One participant was particularly interested in the assessing workforce satisfaction that you're doing at RTS. Could you speak a little bit more about that and the way you see the role of the board in being informed about overall employee satisfaction?
Yeah, I think it's critical for the board to be informed of that and to find out how is the morale of the organization. You know, what are the issues around that? I know that you know, a lot of it has to do with you know, some of the activities are physical in nature, like providing outlets. We have like a gym on board to engage employees for physical health. People want to know if they're getting support from HR, if they have a problem, whether it's a personal problem or you know, an issue with pay or an issue with benefits, that those are being handled correctly. Work environment, the values of the organization, how they are treating one another. Are there conflicts? Getting a sense of that, and are there like we have different events for employees. It could be a film on a particular issue or event, and then getting feedback from them. So we get what we get at the board level, though, are just some high level metrics about, you know, what has been the percentage of engagement. And there's been times in the recent past where that satisfaction has dropped, and we've been trying. That's where it gets into the burnout issue.
Yeah.
So we get feedback on that. So I can get more information on, you know, what exactly they're asking employees, but I know generally we're interested to know, are they engaged in these things? Are they satisfied or not satisfied with the job? And if not,
Yeah.
why?
You know, and I'd encourage the participant to email you directly for further
Yeah.
information.
Yeah, happy to get that.
One thing that you kind of mentioned, but I think bears repeating, and one of our participants chimed in with, I thought, which was a really good comment, which is this notion that all boards need to completely agree all the time, and that everything has to be unanimous. And one of our participants said, you know, for this person, the real issue is not that everybody agrees, but that everybody's heard, which I think is a nice way of saying that, an appropriate way of saying that.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on, you know, useful friction in boards?
Yeah, I think debate and differing opinions is pretty critical. You know, when we were looking for a succession policy, this is a small example, but in the governance committee, or even in the full board, there were some people that felt very strongly that we needed to do a national search versus an internal candidate. That's a small example, but I gave the and over time and over discussion, you know, people came to a consensus that we're going to allow for an internal candidate without doing a national search, and understood why we were in favor of doing that, because we had a good succession planning process in place. And why put people through the expense and hassle of coming in for interviews if you really know you have the person that you want, and you know that it's legal to do that. By the way, you're not obligated to do.
Yep. Yep.
But some people felt like, well, we need to do it because we're a public agency and it looks better. So that's a small example of it. Sometimes we have not fights, but differences about what should the compensation be, what should the service be? You know, should we do the school service, or shouldn't we? You know,
Healthy, respectful dialogue around
Yeah.
issues where board members are expressing their opinions and representing, quote unquote, their constituencies. That's a hallmark of a functioning, effective board.
Exactly. You don't want a rubber stamp board either for the CEO or for the president. You know, if the president says we do it this way, you really want to have a collaborative, consensus building approach. And that's why when the final decision is made and the final vote is taken, you're not going to get people to accept the result if they haven't had that opportunity, if they haven't felt that they've been heard, and if they haven't listened to the other side as well. So I think it's good to have disagreement, but what you don't want to do is push that out into the community and show, you know, a dysfunctional board per se.
Correct. Your Las Vegas approach. Another question. What about when a board member feels strongly that they are only on the board to serve a very specific and sometimes very limited interest of a community they represent versus the system, which you kind of spoke to? How do you see that being managed effectively?
Yeah, you know, that's such a good point, and that's such a good question, because a lot of times we get on boards thinking that's why we're on the board, and that's true to some degree, because, you know, we may represent a certain constituency. But the key here is that as a board member, your responsibility is to that organization ultimately. It's not to where you're coming from. It's to that organization. So you can advance in discussions, you know, the interests of that constituency group, but in the end, you know, your obligation is to the entity. So, for example, you couldn't. It would be wrong for you to say, well, we need to do this no matter what the cost. We need to serve this area or this group, no matter what it costs, and you don't have the money to do it. And it's a bad financial decision. But you feel like you have to stick to your guns because that's who you are. No, you're there to see if you can accomplish the interests, address those stakeholder interests, but also understanding that it has to be within the kind of your obligation to the transit agency itself.
Yeah, no, thank you, Bill. And Chris, our previous presenter, notes that on a board he served, they would wrap up debates on contentious issues with discussion on how to discuss these issues with our membership in the community served, and being sure to honor the board decision, even if folks don't like it, and make sure that it's not just kind of a vote and run away strategy, which I think is as well a good board. Last piece that I wanted to remind folks of, based on what Bill had to say, because he mentioned it quickly, is board members should ride their systems every now and again and know what, you're charged with a leadership role in a rural and urban, an entity providing mobility. You need to see it, feel it, to best understand it. So I think good board members periodically, if not regularly, ride the systems too.
Absolutely. And, in New York, we have a new policy where transit systems have a person representing the disabled community on our board as a voting member. We used to have it as a non-voting member. And that's really important and that's valuable, but every board member has to understand how the system works, not just for one group or the other. Older adults, in my case, I'm interested in that. And we've done some good policy changes as far as reduced fares all the time for older adults, not just off peak, because a lot of older adults work. But it's good. It's just really good to have board members. And this is a negative. This is really a weakness when board members don't know what services are provided by their agency.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Bill. Great session, great information. Again, we'll be sharing this with everyone. And also, again, we will have the closed captioning or the captioning working tomorrow. As we set up, we'll get that set. Ask those questions of the emails of me and others. Make sure that this becomes time well spent for you. Tomorrow, we will start again at 4:00 Eastern time. Same link will get you right in. The two sessions we're going to be doing tomorrow are improving board financial literacy, which is going to be a really good deep dive on that financial oversight piece. And I think an important aspect of what we're doing. And then we're going to do a session on succession planning. Bill was talking about his experience doing that. And I know some of our board members that are out there, that is something right in front of them right now that they're working with. So I think we'll get to some good discussion on that. Thank you for taking the time to join us. I appreciate, Don, the kind comment that you found this helpful. We look forward to seeing you all back here again at 4:00 tomorrow. So with that, be safe and have a good evening.